audience, welcome to HETV program titled Zeidman Software Forensics and Safe on IP. Today, we are very honored to have the creator for this field, software forensics, Mr. Zeidman, to share the essence of software forensics, which is the science of analyzing software source code or binary code to determine whether intellectual property infringement or theft occur. Mr. Zeidman has developed the algorithms, technology, and procedure for code sweep, which has been used in over 100 cases worldwide. Mr. Zeidman has been a consultant and testifying expert on over 250 cases involving billions of dollars of intellectual property rights. Mr. Zeidman is the president and founder of Zeidman Consulting that provide engineering consultancy to law firms regarding intellectual property disputes. And he is also the president and founder of Software Analysis Forensics Engineering Corporation, SAF, which is the leading provider of software intellectual property analysis tools. He's also the author of the book titled The Software IP Detective Handbook, Measurement, Comparison, and Infringement Detection. Let's welcome Mr. Zeidman.
Hi, Mei-Hsin. Thank you very much for having me. I am honored to be here.
Mr. Zeidman, you have conducted hundreds of projects to determine the software infringement. However, the burden of the proof for software infringement are very complicated and require dedicated tool and expertise. So would you mind telling the audience how you apply your tool to examine these alleged devices and examine source code to support litigation?
I'm Bob Zeidman, and I'm going to be talking about detecting software copyright infringement. I'm the president and founder of Software Analysis and Forensic Engineering, and also of Zeidman Consulting. I'm the creator of the field of software forensics. I'm the developer of the Code Suite tool. I'm the author of the book, The Software IP Detective's Handbook, and I have degrees in electrical engineering and physics from Cornell University and Stanford University. I will be discussing U.S. software copyright law, how to define source code, what is source code correlation, what is source code cross-correlation, what is object code correlation, and how to create a software cleanroom. This first section is on U.S. software copyright law. A copyright is a form of protection of intellectual property. It applies to both published and unpublished works. There is a misconception among some people that only published works can be copyrighted, but an unpublished work, such as software, source code, can also be copyrighted. And the copyright gives the author of that work, the creator of that work, the ability to give exclusive rights or to withhold those exclusive rights to others. Those exclusive rights include the right to reproduce the work, the right to prepare derivative works, the right to distribute copies of the works, the right to perform the work publicly, the right to display the work publicly, and in some cases, the right to perform the work publicly by way of digital transmission. Copyright infringement is defined as using one of these rights without the express permission of the author. Here are some important facts about copyright and copyright infringement. You have a copyright once the work is created. You can register the copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office, but you don't have to, unless you're going to litigate. In order to litigate for copyright infringement, you must have registered the copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office. The earlier you register the copyright gives you the ability to get extra damages in litigation. Plus, infringement of a registered copyright is easier to prove because the government has a record that you were the author of this intellectual property In this case, you are the creator of the software. And it's really cheap. You can register a copyright online for somewhere between $45 and $65 US. U.S. copyright law allows for fair use. These are situations where someone can utilize one of the exclusive rights of an author without that author's permission. There are 4 factors that determine fair use. The first one is, what is the purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is for commercial or nonprofit educational purposes. So if someone copies a work, such as your software, in order to make a profit off of it, it's probably not fair use. However, if they're using it to teach a course to students, for example, then that could be fair use. The second characteristic is, what is the nature of the copyrighted work? So, for example, whether the work itself is commercial or nonprofit. Third is the amount and substantiality of the portion that was copied. So if only a very small portion or a very insubstantial, insignificant portion were copied, that could be fair use. And fourth is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. So in other words, if the copied work competes with the original work and reduces the original work's value or the market, then it's probably not fair use. But if it doesn't have an effect on the value or the market for the original, then it could be fair use. For better or worse, these laws are open to interpretation, these rules are open to interpretation, and the courts have not always interpreted them in ways that are favorable to the copyright owner. Recently, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on fair use and seems to have broadened it in a way that harms copyright holders, unfortunately. The most famous case is Oracle v. Google. Oracle had created APIs, which are application programming interfaces, for its Java programming language. Google copied those APIs for its use in its Android operating system. The Supreme Court ruled that that copying was fair use in a decision that confused many people, including myself. It seems that the Supreme Court's ruling applies to open source code, for example. So although open source code has a copyright and can be copied with certain restrictions only, the Supreme Court, I believe, has opened up open source code to being copied in any way whatsoever and calling that copying fair use. I believe also that the Supreme Court's recent ruling extends to all other copyrighted materials, even though they haven't stated that explicitly. Their arguments, which I've looked at, can easily apply also to artwork, music, writing, and other copyrighted materials. The test will come very soon in the case of Goldsmith v. Warhol, 2 artists and artists' estates that are involved in a lawsuit where Andy Warhol, the famous painter, copied material from Goldsmith without her permission. The Supreme Court is going to rule soon on whether that's fair use, and I think if they're consistent, they will rule that this copying was fair use. If they do that, one question that remains is, will open source software survive? If anyone can copy it, they can copy it without the restriction of the open source license, which I believe could destroy the whole open source community. Also, the copier will not have any requirement to give attribution to the original programmer, and most programmers write open source code not for profit, but rather to get recognition of their work. And then the ultimate question is, if Congress does not step in and change the law, and the Supreme Court's decision holds, then will copyright law survive? In other words, will people be able to copy things and just claim that it's fair use? Now let's discuss source code and define it in such a way that we can detect when it's been copied. First, what is source code? So source code is the human readable code that's written by a programmer. It's typically put into a compiler program, And that compiler program turns it into ones and zeros, which is called machine code or object code or executable code that the computer executes to perform a function. For purposes of detecting software copyright infringement, we can break software source code into specific elements. They are basically statements which cause actions and are sequential, comments which comprise documentation within the code that's meant for a human to read and understand the code, and strings which are typically user messages that go out to a user running the code, such as error messages. Statements can be further divided into instructions, which signify the actions to take place, and identifiers, which reference code or data. Instructions are comprised of control words that control the program flow, specifiers that specify data allocations or compiler directives, and operators that manipulate data, for example, addition, subtraction, division, and more complex operators. Identifiers can be broken into variables that identify data, constants that identify constants, functions that identify code that performs specific functions, and labels that specify locations within the program. On the left is an example of some source code. On the right, I show the different elements that make up that source code. And now by clicking, I'm going to color the statements, comments, and strings. With another click, I'm going to color the instructions and the identifiers. And with another click, I'm going to color the control words, operators, variables, constants, functions, and labels to give you an idea of how the code is divided into its elements. Now that I've defined source code and its elements, I'm going to define source code correlation. As with any other mathematical definition of correlation, correlation has a 0 value for completely unrelated source code and has the value of 1 for perfectly related source code. Source code correlation is initially determined for each source code element. So statement correlation is the result of comparing functional lines of source code. Comment and string correlation are the result of comparing non-functional lines of source code. It turns out that it's convenient to combine string and comment correlation because they both do not perform a specific function, but rather display a message to a user of the code. Then there is identifier correlation, which is the result of comparing identifiers in the source code. There is instruction sequence correlation, which is the result of comparing the sequence of instructions in the source code. And then an overall source code correlation that is a multi-dimensional correlation which combines all of the above correlations into a single score. The reason for doing correlation this way, for calculating it this way, is basically that my team and I have done tests over the years when CodeSuite was being developed and these algorithms were being developed, and found that these specific correlations and this specific combination was the best way for detecting copying. To show this mathematically, we create a correlation value for each of the element correlations, and then to create the overall correlation, we take a distance. As if this were a four-dimensional space, the overall correlation is the distance in this overall four-dimensional space. Now, once we've found correlation, that doesn't mean we've found copying. In fact, there are reasons for correlation other than copying. One of them is third-party source code. For example, two programs can use the same third-party source code, and there would be a high correlation because of that common third-party source code, but that would not be due to copying. There are also code generation tools. So if two parties are using the same code generation tools, there would be correlation between the two parties' code even though there had been no copying. There are commonly used elements. Certain words, certain identifiers, certain function names, certain English language words or other language words would typically be found within source code, and yet they would not be signs of copying. There are common algorithms. There's certain algorithms for calculating certain functions, performing certain functions that are taught in schools, for example, that are taught in textbooks, that are taught online. And so we would expect correlation due to these common algorithms rather than copying. There's common author. It could be that one person has a style of writing code, a programmer has a style of writing code, goes to another company, uses that same style, does not copy the code, but there's correlation due to that code being written in both places by the same person. However, if all of those other reasons can be eliminated as the reasons for correlation, and there's still correlation left, the conclusion is that copying occurred. The next step, of course, is a legal step to determine legally whether that copying was fair use or copyright infringement or perhaps some other reason, such as the person doing the copying, the programmer, had the permission to copy that code. So the tool that my company has developed is called Code Suite. It has many different functions within that suite of tools. And the first one that's used to help determine whether copyright infringement occurred is code match. To use the code match function of Code Suite, you would enter one party's code into the program and another party's code into the program. Code match would generate a series of correlations between files in both programs, and if those correlations were high enough, in fact, if they're non-zero, they could be indications of copying. Not necessarily, so further action is needed, but they would be a sign that further action is needed. To detect copyright infringement, you would first run code match to find all of the matching code elements. You would then run source detective, which searches the internet to find where those matching code elements can be found, for example, in third-party code, in open source code, perhaps they're common English language words or common other language words or common programming words. You would then generate a report to look at the results. You would then create a filter to start filtering out things that you knew were not signs of copying, but signs of one of the other factors, such as common author. And then you would repeat generating a report, creating a filter, generating a new report after the filtering's been done. You continue to do that until there's nothing else to filter out. If after you've done all the filtering out all the elements that are not due to copying, if you have any elements that are correlated, those need to be looked at further and are most likely signs of copying. This slide shows a simple basic report that comes out of CodeMatch showing file pairs and their correlation scores. You can then click on a correlation score to get a more detailed report. This slide shows a more detailed report generated by CodeMatch in which it tells you which lines of code, which types of code, which elements of code were correlated between the two source code files so that you can examine them, determine what to filter out, and also determine what is due to copying and what is due to other reasons. CodeSuite has a filtering function that allows you to filter out any identifiers, comments, strings, statements, files, folders that you've already decided are correlated but not due to copying. You can also change various thresholds and do other kinds of sophisticated filtering to remove things from the analysis that you have determined are not due to copying. This slide shows a diagram for the filtering process to filter out things that are not due to copying. So first you would filter out third-party code using Source Detective. You would filter out code generated by code generation tools. You can use Source Detective. You can also use other methods. You would then filter out common identifier names. Again, Source Detective is very useful in doing that. You can filter out common algorithms, then filter out common author. Common author is often shown by regularly misspelled words, for example, or unique phrases and identifier names that this particular programmer prefers. And then finally, after you've filtered out everything, if any correlations remain, that would be due to copying. In order to detect software copyright infringement, we would also look at source code cross-correlation. This is a correlation between functional code in one program to comments in another program. The reason we do this is that it's not uncommon for programmers to copy code and then comment it out. In other words, turn it into non-functional comments and use it as a guide for writing new code based on the old code. This is still copyright infringement. And so we use source code cross-correlation to determine whether this happened. Often when programmers do this, they will delete the comments, but sometimes they leave the comments in, and we'll find commented out code in one program that correlates highly with actual functional code in the other program, and that's almost always a sign of copying. For source code cross-correlation, we define two kinds of correlations. One is statement to comment or string correlation, and the other is comment or string to statement correlation. So just we look at statements in one program and compare them to comments and strings in the other program, and then do the reverse. And then we combine them into an overall cross-correlation, and this is determined by the code cross function of CodeSweep. When a party to a litigation or a potential litigation doesn't have access to the other party's source code, they typically can get access to the object code, which is a downloadable file, for example, that's run on the computer. And for this, to determine software copyright infringement, we would perform a calculation for object code correlation. We can find object code correlation in two different ways. The first way, we enter the source code of one program and the object code of another program into the bitmatch function of CodeSweep. That will produce a series of correlations, which can be a warning to investigate further to see whether copying occurred. Another way to calculate object code correlation is to input the object code of one program and the object code of a second program into the bitmatch function of CodeSweep, which will then produce a series of correlation scores that can be examined to determine whether it needs to be investigated further to find copying. If bitmatch is comparing source code to object code, then it outputs a source to object code correlation score. If it's comparing object code to object code, then it puts out object to object code correlation scores. Now I'll discuss further how to use bitmatch to detect copyright infringement. The process for using bitmatch to find copyright infringement is identical to the one for using CodeMatch. You first run bitmatch. You then run source detective to find the elements that were matched according to bitmatch, and source detective will determine whether those can be found and are common on the internet. You generate a report to review the results. You create filters based on your knowledge, but also based on what source detective finds, and filter out those things that are correlated but not due to copying. You then repeat steps 3 and 4, continually generating reports, filtering out correlations that are not due to copying. When you can no longer filter anything out, if there's no correlation, then there's no copying. If there is correlation, then you've most likely found indicators of copying. When developing code, it's important to understand how to set up a software cleanroom development environment to avoid accidentally copying code from another party. An example of this is if your company hires a team of programmers away from your competitor, you may want to set up a cleanroom development environment to avoid accidentally utilizing any code that came from the previous employer that is now your competitor. To set up a software cleanroom, you basically have two rooms, one called a dirty room and the other called the clean room. The dirty room consists of people who have been exposed to your competitor's code. The clean room consists of people who have never been exposed to your competitor's code. In the dirty room, the programmers there can write up general specifications that do not include any code or code examples. They then send that communication of a high-level specification through an independent monitor. The monitor has no stake in the outcome. They are unbiased. They're experts in intellectual property. They utilize Code Suite, and they make sure that nothing that's proprietary is coming through the communication from the dirty room to the clean room. In other words, there is no code from a competitor, there's no information from a competitor, there's only high-level specifications going to the clean room. The programmers in the clean room then are allowed to develop code independently based on this high-level functionality, this high-level description that's been monitored by this independent, unbiased monitor. Any questions that the programmers have, they send that to the monitor. The monitor makes sure that the questions do not accidentally create a situation where the dirty room programmers would need to send code. And if the questions are okay, they send those questions back to the programmers in the dirty room. So all communications go through the unbiased monitor, and this ensures that only high-level descriptions and no actual code or actual copyrighted materials get sent from the dirty room to the clean room. In this presentation, I've discussed what are US software copyright laws, how do you define source code, how do you define source code correlation, and source code cross-correlation, and object code correlation, and how to develop a clean room. I'm Bob Zeidman, the founder of Software Analysis and Forensic Engineering. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions or want more information, please contact me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Zeidman, for your detailed enlightenment. See you on our next program. And dear audience, please do come back next Wednesday at 1 p.m. for Zeidman Software Forensics and Self on IP on HETV. Do not miss the opportunity to sharpen your skill and enhance your proficiency for career competence.